Hi guys, I hope you are comfortable and ready for a long story tonight, because this one will carry us back in time to a world filled with silence, fear, and strange resilience. But before we begin, I am curious, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are now? Is it evening, late night, or maybe even early morning on the other side of the world? I always find it fascinating to imagine someone lying in bed in a small apartment in New York, or perhaps in a quiet house in the countryside of Canada, or maybe somewhere far across the ocean, listening to the same story at a completely different hour, as though history itself stretches out like a thread that ties us together across time zones, across distances, across languages. Tonight, that thread leads us into occupied Asia, during the years of the Second World War, when the Japanese Empire stretched its shadow across vast territories, and everyday life for millions of ordinary men, women, and children changed overnight. Imagine, for a moment, living in a town that had known the same rhythm of mornings and evenings for generations. The call of vendors in the marketplace, the smell of rice steaming in iron pots, children running barefoot through narrow alleys, and the distant hum of cicadas in the heat of the afternoon. Then suddenly, one morning, you wake to the sound of heavy boots on cobblestones, the unfamiliar bark of foreign commands, the fluttering banners marked with symbols you do not yet understand, and the unsettling realization that your home is no longer truly yours, that everything familiar has shifted into something uncertain and strange. The first days of occupation always carried a peculiar tension, a mix of stunned silence and quiet attempts at normalcy. People still went to fetch water from wells, women still spread laundry across bamboo poles, and farmers still drove their oxen through muddy fields. Yet in the background the air itself felt heavier, as if the presence of soldiers with rifles slung across their shoulders had soaked into every wall, every doorway, every glance exchanged in the street. Some people peered cautiously from behind shutters, trying to count how many soldiers had entered the town, while others forced smiles and greeted them with hesitant bows, unsure if defiance or politeness would mean survival. Children, curious and unafraid at first, whispered to each other about the tall helmets and sharp swords the newcomers carried, comparing them to figures from folk tales or ghosts from old bedtime stories. But they were quickly pulled back by anxious mothers who reminded them not to stare, not to point, not to draw attention. In the evenings, neighbors gathered in hushed circles around dim lamps, sharing fragments of rumors. That the Japanese army had already taken the capital, that resistance was forming in the hills, that food would soon become scarce, that schools would be changed, that the emperor in Tokyo demanded respect as if he were a living god. Nobody knew which whispers to believe, and so people believed all of them, adding to the fog of uncertainty that hung over every household. At the market, the transformation was immediate. The bright cloth banners that once advertised stalls in the local script were replaced or covered with Japanese characters. Prices shifted overnight, and where once there had been laughter and bargaining, now there was subdued silence, as though each coin passed from hand to hand was a reminder that even trade, even bread and rice, were no longer safe from watchful eyes. A woman selling vegetables whispered to her neighbor that soldiers had ordered everyone to bow when they passed, and that failure to do so could mean punishment. A fisherman muttered that soon the catch would no longer be sold freely, that the best fish would be taken for the army. And above all, there lingered the sound of boots. Boots on the stone streets, boots near the schoolyard, boots echoing in the courtyard of the town hall where proclamations were read in clipped voices no one fully understood. As night fell, the atmosphere changed again. Where once children might have played in the street until the last light faded, now they were ushered inside long before sunset. Lamps were dimmed, curtains drawn tightly, and the streets grew unnaturally quiet. The first announcement of a curfew came quickly, and from that moment the town learned to fear the dark in a new way. for the silence of night was broken only by the metallic rattle of bayonets and the deliberate rhythm of marching patrols. Dogs barked nervously, doors creaked shut, and even the insects seemed subdued, as if nature itself was reluctant to disturb the fragile surface of fear that lay over the town. It was in this new silence that people realized their lives had truly changed, not with a single violent battle or sudden explosion, but with the slow, heavy weight of presence. The uniforms, the rules, the watchful eyes, the knowledge that nothing they said or did was entirely safe. This was the beginning of life under Japanese occupation, and it was only the first breath of a story that would unfold through hunger, resilience, and the quiet courage of people who learned to endure when every day felt like a gamble with fate. As dawn broke over the town, a thin mist lingered over the streets, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and wet earth from the night before, and the townspeople slowly began to emerge from their homes, cautious and uncertain, yet drawn by the curiosity that humans carry even in fear, for there was always a desire to witness the world even when it was changing in ways one could not yet comprehend. The Japanese soldiers moved with a precise, almost mechanical grace, their polished boots tapping against cobblestones in synchronized rhythm, their faces expressionless but watchful, and for the first time many residents noticed the meticulous attention to detail that the occupiers brought with them. The way tents were pitched in straight lines, the way banners were tied to poles, the exacting arrangement of supply carts and patrols, as though the town itself were a chessboard being arranged by invisible hands. In the marketplaces, vendors cautiously set out their goods, placing bundles of vegetables and grains on wooden stalls. Yet many tables remained empty, and whispers moved faster than footsteps as neighbors exchanged information. "They have taken control of the central square," one elderly man said in a low voice, "and anyone caught selling outside the designated stalls will be fined, or worse." Children who had peered from windows yesterday now stayed behind tightly drawn curtains, but they still pressed their faces to the glass, observing the soldiers inspecting carts, measuring sacks of rice, and occasionally knocking on doors to verify that households had registered their members according to new regulations. In some cases, a soldier would scribble notes in a small book, and the townspeople could only guess what those notations might mean. Rationing, labor assignments, or something more ominous that no one dared to say aloud. Schools were transformed almost overnight, as teachers who had once guided children through lessons in history and mathematics now found themselves teaching Japanese phrases, reading passages glorifying the emperor, and conducting exercises that reinforced strict discipline. Children were instructed to bow at the entrance of classrooms, recite new slogans in unison, and memorize unfamiliar hymns, while parents watched from the shadows, unsure whether to correct their children's pronunciation or remain silent to avoid attention. Even the youngest pupils, previously oblivious to politics and war, sensed a strange tension in the air, noticing the differences in behavior between their friends and the solemnity with which the teachers now spoke, as if the very walls had absorbed the presence of the soldiers and imposed their authority on every corner of the schoolroom. As the day wore on, the realities of occupation became clearer. Farmers who brought produce from surrounding villages found themselves halted at checkpoints, questioned by officers in crisp uniforms who demanded identification and documentation, while women carrying water from wells were sometimes forced to wait until soldiers finished their patrols. Rumors spread rapidly that families who resisted orders had been sent to labor camps, that confiscations were increasing, that neighbors could not be fully trusted because collaboration sometimes promised survival. At the same time, however, there were subtle acts of quiet defiance. A shopkeeper slipping a few extra grains of rice into a bag for a struggling neighbor, children learning secret songs from their parents, and elders speaking in hushed tones about the past and traditions, keeping alive memories that the occupiers sought to suppress. Even leisure, once a simple pleasure, was altered. In the late afternoon, small groups gathered in courtyards or under trees to share brief moments of respite, playing quiet games with pebbles, weaving simple mats, or reading from hidden books, always alert to the possibility of a passing patrol. The townspeople quickly learned the language of glances and gestures. A nod meant all was clear, a cough might signal danger, and silence became as meaningful as speech. The rhythm of life adjusted not by choice but by necessity, as every action, every step, every word carried weight beyond its apparent simplicity. By evening, the town settled into an uneasy calm, with families drawing curtains, lighting lanterns that flickered softly against the darkened walls, and sharing modest meals of rice and vegetables. Conversations were brief, often punctuated with cautious laughter to mask unease, and the children lay in bed wondering how the world outside could feel so familiar yet so strange. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a military drumbeat echoed, marking the passage of time, a reminder that the town's routines were no longer entirely their own, and that the first days of occupation had left an indelible imprint on the psyche of every resident, shaping the way they would see, act, and endure for the months and years to come. Even in these earliest days, when fear mingled with adaptation, the people discovered an unexpected truth. Life, no matter how constrained, still persisted. The market still operated under watchful eyes, children still found ways to play, and families still found moments to share food and stories, creating small islands of normalcy in a sea of change. It was a delicate balance, a constant negotiation between compliance and quiet resistance, and it was only the beginning of a long journey through hunger, hope, and resilience that would define existence under the shadow of occupation. Life under occupation soon became a constant negotiation with scarcity, a slow and deliberate dance around rules imposed by soldiers who had little interest in understanding the lives they now controlled. And for the townspeople, survival became the foremost concern, shaping every movement, every choice, and even the way they thought about the simplest aspects of daily life. In the morning, mothers and fathers would rise before the sun, walking carefully through streets where the patrols had already begun their rounds, carrying baskets with vegetables, small portions of rice, or scraps of food collected from previous days, always aware that any misstep could draw the attention of a soldier who might demand identification, rations, or explanations that could not be satisfactorily given. Even familiar pathways were now fraught with tension. The route to the well might be longer, the bridge over the river under constant watch, and the alleyways once used for casual gatherings now silent, emptied of children and casual chatter. The introduction of ration cards altered life in ways both visible and invisible. Each family was allotted a specific portion of rice, oil, and occasionally sugar or salt, and merchants were strictly monitored to ensure compliance with these rules. Standing in line for supplies, neighbors exchanged hurried whispers, talking about rumors of hidden caches in distant villages or secret gardens behind walls, while children tried to play quietly without drawing attention to themselves. The ration cards themselves became a symbol of survival and control. A faded piece of paper could mean the difference between a family eating that day and going hungry, and so the townspeople treated them with reverence, tucking them carefully into pockets and purses, never letting them out of sight, and always being wary of strangers who might take note of them. Markets, though constrained, remained the lifeblood of the town, a place where small transactions carried profound significance. Vendors whispered about goods arriving from distant provinces, about merchants who had found ways to trade secretly with soldiers willing to look the other way, and about families who bartered chickens or cloth for a handful of rice or a piece of dried fish. Some traders became masters of subtlety, hiding extra portions beneath piles of ordinary goods, exchanging small nods and glances with trusted customers. While others risked severe punishment for minor errors, their courage or desperation marking the fragile line between survival and tragedy. Food was no longer merely sustenance. It was a currency of hope and connection. Families grew tiny vegetable patches behind houses, tended secret herb gardens on rooftops, and learned to preserve fish and vegetables for weeks using crude methods, drying and salting in ways that their grandparents might have recognized but the occupying soldiers could not detect. Recipes changed. Soups became thinner, meat was rare and reserved for special occasions, and leaves and wild herbs were added to dishes to stretch meager portions. In these moments of preparation, in the careful chopping of vegetables or the hushed laughter of children helping to stir a pot of rice, life persisted in defiance of the constraints imposed by occupation, and each meal became an act of resilience, a quiet statement that humanity could endure even when the world seemed determined to strip it away. Beyond food, the community developed subtle codes of communication to navigate the constant presence of Japanese soldiers. A whistle, a cough, or a particular knock could signal danger or provide reassurance. Children learned to deliver messages in playful disguises, carrying notes tucked into toys or slipping letters under doors, while adults relied on memory and shorthand to avoid detection. These small acts of coordination, often taken for granted, became essential for survival and for the preservation of a sense of agency amid overwhelming control. Stories circulated rapidly, sometimes based on fact, sometimes stretched by fear or imagination. Tales of villagers who had hidden entire families in caves to escape forced labor, of merchants who had secretly exchanged rice for clothing for the elderly, of children who had sneaked into fields to gather wild vegetables while pretending to play. Even casual gossip carried meaning, a reminder that information could save a life, warn of danger, or build a network of quiet resistance. In this way, daily survival was not merely about food and shelter. It was about knowledge, awareness, and the ability to read the rhythms of an occupied world with keen perception. By nightfall, the streets once again emptied. Lanterns flickered in modest homes, and families shared small meals that were both nourishing and symbolic, reinforcing bonds that occupation could not sever. Parents told stories that reminded children of times before the soldiers arrived, stories of festivals, markets, and games, blending memory and imagination to keep hope alive. In these quiet evenings, the town learned the delicate balance of endurance, adapting to new realities while holding on to traditions, obeying when necessary while subtly preserving identity, and finding meaning in even the smallest gestures of care and attention. Survival under occupation became both an art and a necessity, a continuous negotiation between fear and hope, scarcity and resourcefulness, vigilance and subtle defiance, and through it all, the townspeople discovered that even in constrained circumstances, life could persist, adapt, and quietly resist, preparing them for the months and years that would follow, as the shadow of occupation stretched across the landscape, shaping every heartbeat, every choice, and every whispered story shared. Behind closed doors, by the following weeks, the initial shock of occupation had settled into a harsh rhythm, and the townspeople were beginning to understand that life would now revolve around work in ways they had never experienced before. Men and even older boys were frequently summoned for labor, often on projects dictated by the occupying army. Repairing roads, carrying heavy loads of timber, constructing makeshift barracks or fortifications, and transporting supplies from one checkpoint to another. The work was relentless, performed under the sharp eyes of overseers who carried batons or rifles and demanded efficiency and silence. And those who faltered or dared to complain often received brutal punishment, a slap, a kick, or worse, that left both body and spirit aching. Despite the grueling conditions, a sense of collective endurance began to form among the laborers. Whispered encouragements, shared moments of laughter when no one was watching, and small acts of kindness, like offering a piece of bread to a fellow worker who had gone without, became vital threads of humanity in an otherwise oppressive environment. Women, left behind in the villages and towns, faced a different set of challenges. Many were responsible not only for cooking, cleaning, and tending to children, but also for managing the household under conditions of extreme scarcity. They learned to stretch small portions of rice into multiple meals, to gather wild herbs and roots that could substitute for vegetables, and to preserve what little protein they could find. In addition, some women were compelled to assist in labor as well, either by tending to soldiers' quarters, working in makeshift hospitals, or participating in assembly tasks at factories commandeered by the Japanese. The weight of responsibility was immense, and while fear was a constant companion, a quiet strength grew in the women who maintained the life of the household and, in doing so, preserved the sense of normalcy for their children and neighbors. Not all labor was outwardly visible. Some people were quietly forced to contribute in ways that left them little choice. Sewing uniforms, mending shoes, or even assisting in propaganda activities such as painting banners or distributing official notices. These tasks, while less physically demanding, carried their own psychological toll, as each brushstroke or delivered message reinforced the presence of the occupiers in the town, a reminder that every citizen, willingly or unwillingly, was now part of a system designed to control and subdue them. Yet even here, subtle resistance appeared. A poorly sewn uniform, a slightly smudged banner, a whispered joke among those performing the task, small acts that allowed people to reclaim a sliver of agency while minimizing risk. The brutality of some overseers became an unspoken subject of conversation. One man who had returned from a day of transporting timber described how a supervisor had struck a worker for moving too slowly, how the man had fallen to the ground, bruised and humiliated, yet continued his labor because the alternative, being sent to a remote worksite or detention, was far worse. Stories like these spread quickly, not to incite rebellion but to reinforce caution, teaching families which behaviors might provoke wrath and how to navigate the delicate balance between compliance and survival. In this environment, knowledge became as valuable as food, and observation was as essential as strength. Amid this backdrop, small acts of care took on extraordinary significance. Men would secretly share water or rice with those less fortunate. Women would hide extra portions for neighbors in need, and children, who sometimes accompanied parents to work sites, learned early that life was measured not only by fear but also by the quiet gestures that preserved dignity and humanity. Even the simplest smiles, brief conversations, and gentle touches became precious, fleeting moments that reminded everyone that beyond the uniforms and commands, ordinary people still carried hearts, memories, and dreams. The dynamic of work and labor also created subtle social hierarchies, not through wealth or status, but through the ability to navigate occupations successfully. Some families developed reputations for cleverness in avoiding overwork or for quietly assisting others without drawing attention, while others became known for missteps that drew scrutiny or punishment. These reputations shaped interactions in the market, at the well, and along the streets, influencing alliances and friendships in ways that were invisible to outsiders but critical to the survival of those living under constant observation. By nightfall, exhausted laborers returned home, their bodies bruised, their hands calloused, but their spirits still tethered to the familiar comforts of hearth and home. Women who had spent the day managing both household and work quietly organized simple meals, prepared the next day's rationed food, and ensured that children were tucked into bed with at least the semblance of normalcy. Even in these small routines, there was resistance, a quiet assertion that despite the constant presence of authority, life, memory, and human connection could not be entirely taken away. It was in these moments that the first seeds of resilience were planted, the understanding that survival required both strength and ingenuity, endurance and compassion, and that even under the harshest labor demands, the human spirit could find ways to endure, adapt, and quietly defy the forces that sought to dominate it. As the weeks turned into months, life under occupation began to reveal layers beyond mere survival, and one of the most subtle yet pervasive aspects of control was found within the walls of schools, where the rhythms of childhood were reshaped to align with the expectations of the occupiers. Children, who had once learned local history, literature, and mathematics in familiar classrooms filled with laughter and chatter, were now instructed to recite Japanese phrases, memorize the emperor's slogans, and bow repeatedly at entrances and ceremonies that seemed foreign and sometimes frightening, as if the very act of learning had become inseparable from obedience. Teachers, often torn between duty and fear, attempted to navigate this new curriculum, sometimes whispering encouragement to students in their native tongue while outwardly maintaining a stern demeanor that matched the authority imposed from above. Parents watched anxiously as their children adapted, observing the small gestures, the subtle shifts in tone, and the hesitant smiles that betrayed confusion and curiosity alike. Some attempted to correct their children at home, teaching forgotten words or stories in secret, while others remained silent, fearful that any intervention might draw attention from neighbors or informants. The classrooms themselves, stripped of familiar posters, books, and decorations, became spaces where uniformity was prized above creativity, where individuality was discouraged, and where even small acts of defiance, a mispronounced word, a smudged brushstroke in calligraphy, a lingering glance at a forbidden illustration, carried weight. Radio broadcasts became another thread in the tapestry of control, filtering into homes and public spaces with carefully curated news and music that reinforced Japanese authority and ideology. Families gathered around these devices in subdued tones, listening for updates on the war, announcements regarding rationing or labor, or speeches that emphasized loyalty and respect for the emperor. Yet even in these moments, people learned to read between the lines, detecting nuance, exaggeration, or omissions, and sometimes sharing interpretations in hushed conversations once the broadcast had ended. Children learned quickly that the messages were not to be taken at face value, that questions whispered to a sibling or parent could reveal the reality behind the carefully chosen words, and that understanding the world required attention, skepticism, and imagination. Outside the classroom and the household, the visual presence of propaganda shaped the town in every detail. Posters adorned walls, banners hung from poles, and signs reminded citizens of rules, expectations, and consequences, while statues or images of the emperor became focal points for both respect and quiet scrutiny. Residents developed a language of subtle gestures and behaviors, avoiding eye contact with certain images, maintaining a polite yet cautious bow, or walking slightly off the beaten path to avoid scrutiny. In this way, the town learned to function within an imposed narrative while simultaneously preserving its own stories, traditions, and understanding of reality. Children's play, once free and uninhibited, adapted to these conditions as well. Games were conducted in smaller spaces, whispers replaced shouts, and even laughter carried the weight of caution. Yet these adaptations revealed the resilience of youth. Imaginative play continued, stories were shared that harkened back to times before occupation, and secret lessons were imparted between friends, ensuring that knowledge of culture, language, and heritage endured. Parents and elders played their part, weaving old tales into conversations, creating subtle exercises that reinforced memory and identity, and fostering resilience that would be vital in the months and years ahead. Amid the routines of school, family, and home, small acts of subtle defiance persisted. A child might draw pictures depicting familiar landscapes or local festivals. A teacher might linger over a lesson on folk tales before transitioning to the prescribed curriculum, and parents might whisper encouragement about courage, loyalty to family, or survival strategies. These acts, often unnoticed by the authorities, provided continuity, comfort, and a quiet assertion that the core of life could not be wholly reshaped by external power. Even as the town adjusted to these educational and propagandistic pressures, an underlying tension persisted. Residents knew that every word, every gesture, and every glance could carry implications beyond immediate understanding. They learned to navigate a complex landscape of observation and expectation, teaching children both the practicalities of obedience and the subtleties of discretion, so that life could continue in measured rhythm. And in this delicate balance between imposed authority and personal integrity, the townspeople discovered that survival depended not only on food, labor, and shelter, but also on the cultivation of awareness, ingenuity, and quiet resistance, threads of human experience that would persist even in the most constrained circumstances. By evening, as lanterns flickered and children whispered to one another about lessons and secret stories, the town settled once again into an uneasy calm. The streets were empty, the sounds of marching soldiers had faded, and families huddled in homes where the faint glow of a lamp illuminated worn pages of books, hidden notes, and drawings, tokens of continuity in a world of upheaval. Even under constant oversight, even amid pervasive propaganda, life endured, subtly defiant, quietly resilient, and slowly learning to survive under the steady gaze of occupation. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across narrow streets and alleys, the town began its nightly transformation, a quiet ritual born out of necessity and fear, for nightfall under occupation brought a peculiar tension, a sense that every sound, every flicker of light, every distant footstep could carry consequences far beyond the ordinary. Lanterns were carefully lit within homes, their glow softened by thin cloths to avoid drawing attention, and the soft rustle of families preparing dinner or putting children to bed was accompanied by the constant, low hum of vigilance that had become second nature in these months of occupation. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and families moved through rooms with deliberate care, mindful of the curfew that had been strictly imposed, and aware that soldiers could patrol any street, appearing without warning to enforce compliance. The streets themselves, once alive with laughter, chatter, and the clatter of carts returning from the market, now lay almost entirely silent. Occasionally, a dog would bark in the distance, its sound sharp against the heavy quiet, or a bicycle might squeak faintly as someone attempted to reach a neighbor without being noticed. Shadows played across walls, and residents learned to interpret the faintest signals. A flickering light might indicate that someone had been caught in violation. A hurried knock might signal that a patrol was approaching, and even the wind moving through alleyways carried potential danger. In this environment, silence became both shield and language, a way to communicate caution, reassurance, or warning without speaking aloud. The curfew was enforced with methodical precision. Soldiers, moving in small squads, followed established routes through the town, their boots echoing against cobblestones, rifles carried at the ready, and eyes scanning every doorway, alley, and window. Occasionally, they would stop a passerby, demanding identification or questioning their purpose, and even the briefest interaction carried weight, a reminder that the night did not belong to the townspeople but to those who now commanded it. Families taught children to lie still under blankets, to remain calm in silence, and to trust the judgment of adults who had learned to read every nuance of the occupiers' behavior. Despite the ever-present fear, life found quiet ways to persist. In hidden courtyards or behind closed shutters, neighbors might exchange whispered words, offering news, small comforts, or advice on avoiding punishment. Children huddled with their siblings, sharing stories of a world beyond the occupation, tales of past festivals, or imaginings of what freedom might look like when the sun rose again. In kitchens, women prepared meals with care, stretching limited ingredients and preserving extra portions, while men recounted the day's events in hushed tones, discussing who had been summoned for labor, what the patrols had observed, and which families might be at risk. Every conversation, every movement, was conducted with a heightened awareness that the smallest misstep could have far-reaching consequences. Amid this nightly routine, rumors of resistance began to circulate more frequently, whispered carefully from one household to another. Tales of partisans hiding in nearby forests, sabotage in distant towns, and secret messages carried by brave villagers provided both hope and trepidation. Some families feared that such stories were traps designed to lure them into punishment, yet the very act of sharing them became an assertion of humanity, a subtle way of resisting the totalizing control imposed upon daily life. The line between vigilance and paranoia was thin, and residents learned to navigate it delicately, trusting instinct and observation more than any spoken word. In the quiet hours, when even whispers faded, the town seemed suspended in a strange, uneasy liminality. The stars above shone with indifferent clarity, and the moon cast silver light on rooftops and narrow streets, revealing patterns of life that were both familiar and strangely altered. Windows reflected the flicker of lamps inside homes, hinting at the presence of families who, despite exhaustion and fear, maintained routines that had once seemed ordinary. The reading of books, the sharing of stories, the gentle rocking of a child to sleep. In these moments, life felt fragile yet persistent, a delicate weave of endurance, adaptation, and quiet defiance that allowed the town to survive each night under the watchful eyes of occupation. By the early hours, when the first birds stirred and the faint glow of dawn crept over distant hills, the townspeople waited in stillness for the curfew to lift, for the streets to regain their cautious activity, and for the day to begin again. Night had tested their patience, their courage, and their ingenuity, and in surviving it, they had learned lessons that no classroom or market could teach. The power of observation, the importance of subtlety, and the resilience that comes from protecting life, dignity, and family in a world governed by fear. Even in darkness, the quiet pulse of the town endured, a testament to the unyielding persistence of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. As the occupation extended into months, the town began to feel the subtler pressures of cultural control, a slow erosion of traditions and rituals that had once marked the rhythm of everyday life. Yet even as official edicts sought to suppress these customs, the townspeople found quiet ways to preserve them, adapting practices to fit the constraints of surveillance and scarcity. Traditional festivals, once celebrated with music, dance, and the scent of incense, became hushed affairs. Families lit candles behind closed shutters, recited familiar prayers and whispers, and shared small portions of festive foods that had been rationed or replaced with substitutes found in secret gardens. Children, initially disappointed by the absence of parades or gatherings, learned to create miniature celebrations in courtyards or under trees, fashioning paper decorations and playing improvised games that recalled the laughter and excitement of preoccupation times. Elders, recognizing the danger of overt defiance, became the custodians of memory and tradition, passing down stories, songs, and customs in the quiet moments of daily life. They taught young ones about local legends, heroic figures, and rituals tied to the seasons, always careful to couch instructions in the language of play or education, so that the lessons could continue without drawing unwanted attention. A small act, such as baking a symbolic cake or weaving a decorative pattern, became a statement of continuity, a signal that life, heritage, and identity could not be entirely erased by banners and uniformed patrols. Markets and public spaces reflected similar tensions. Traders adapted by blending the familiar with the mandated. Colorful textiles were folded beneath official goods. Local music was played quietly between transactions, and traditional foods were sold in modest quantities, often under the watchful eyes of soldiers but shielded by subtle gestures, nods, and timing. People exchanged recipes for dishes that had become scarce, shared tips on growing small rooftop gardens, and even taught children to recognize edible plants in nearby fields, ensuring that knowledge of culture and sustenance persisted despite external pressures. Children, resilient and imaginative, became adept at creating spaces for play and learning that escaped adult scrutiny. They fashioned miniature markets, played pretend games that mirrored the world around them, and developed secret codes to communicate with friends while evading the watchful gaze of soldiers. In some ways, these games mirrored the survival strategies of adults, teaching the young how to navigate restrictions, anticipate danger, and preserve joy in constrained circumstances. Laughter, though quieter and more carefully managed than before, remained a powerful reminder that life could continue, even when the larger world imposed fear and control. Meanwhile, rumors and tales continued to circulate, blending fact, imagination, and hope. Some spoke of distant villages where traditional festivals had been held in defiance of edicts, others of families who secretly sheltered musicians or storytellers, and yet others of children who had managed to organize hidden games that imitated preoccupation customs. These stories, shared carefully, reinforced a sense of collective memory, continuity, and subtle resistance, teaching everyone, young and old alike, that cultural identity was not entirely dependent on public observance but could survive in private spaces, whispered words, and shared gestures. The town's landscape itself reflected these shifts. Courtyards, hidden gardens, and quiet lanes became centers of activity that could not be fully monitored, spaces where creativity, tradition, and memory persisted in miniature. Walls bore faint traces of murals or decorations hastily covered when patrols approached, but each mark served as a reminder that expression, art, and joy could find ways to survive even under surveillance. Parents encouraged children to memorize folk songs, to recreate traditional dances in confined spaces, and to understand the meanings behind festivals and rituals, ensuring that knowledge passed down through generations remained intact, even if the outward celebration was subdued. By nightfall, after a day of adapted schooling, labor, and restricted play, the town settled into its familiar pattern of lanterns, quiet meals, and hushed conversations. Stories, songs, and games shared behind doors and shutters became the lifeblood of cultural preservation, reminding everyone that even under strict control, the human spirit could find ways to maintain continuity, creativity, and joy. These subtle acts of cultural endurance laid the foundation for resilience, teaching both children and adults that identity and tradition could persist, quietly and steadfastly, even when the larger world seemed intent on erasing them. As the months of occupation stretched on, a new layer of life quietly emerged beneath the visible routines of labor, school, and curfew, an intricate network of hidden connections that allowed the townspeople to support one another in ways that the soldiers could not fully detect. Neighbors exchanged small parcels of food, notes, or medicine through prearranged signals, slipping packages beneath doors or leaving them in inconspicuous spots in alleys, all under the constant awareness that discovery could bring punishment not only to the giver but also to the recipient. These acts, often modest in scale, became the lifeblood of survival, reinforcing trust and solidarity in a world that seemed designed to isolate and control every individual. Children, trained by necessity in observation and discretion, became small couriers of messages, carrying folded slips of paper tucked into toys, hollowed-out books, or even bundles of herbs. They moved carefully, often under the guise of play, their awareness of patrol patterns and household routines surpassing their years, and in doing so, they became vital participants in the underground network. Parents taught them subtle gestures, coded words, and timing that allowed information and supplies to move through the town without detection. And the young learned that even seemingly insignificant movements could hold meaning of great consequence. Rumors, long a tool of both fear and hope, became a currency within this hidden system. Villagers shared information about which families were being observed closely, where food or supplies could be obtained, and which soldiers had a reputation for leniency or cruelty. The stories, carefully curated and quietly circulated, created a web of intelligence that allowed residents to anticipate danger, plan small acts of resistance, and protect one another. Some tales were exaggerated, others based on first-hand observation, yet all contributed to a sense of coordination and mutual reliance that had previously been unnecessary in daily life. Occasionally, more deliberate acts of resistance occurred, often improvised and carefully measured to avoid catastrophic repercussions. A small group might divert a delivery of rice to families in need, hide tools or supplies from labor sites, or leave false trails to confuse patrolling soldiers. These actions were rarely publicized, known only to the participants and a few trusted neighbors, but they created a sense of agency, a reminder that even under strict control, ordinary people could find ways to assert influence over their circumstances. Each success, however minor, became a story passed quietly, strengthening morale and reinforcing the idea that survival was not only about obedience but also about ingenuity and courage. The underground network extended beyond the town itself. Families who had relatives in nearby villages maintained secret lines of communication, exchanging warnings, supplies, and information about patrols and rationing. Couriers traveled discreetly at dawn or dusk, taking advantage of shadowed paths, natural cover, and intimate knowledge of terrain. The network required careful planning, trust, and adaptability, as any error could compromise not only the mission but also the safety of everyone involved. Yet it persisted, a testament to human resilience and the determination to retain some control over life under occupation. In homes, these efforts were often accompanied by subtle training and preparation. Children learned to recognize coded signals, to memorize routes, and to observe quietly without drawing attention. Adults practiced discretion in speech and movement, often rehearsing scenarios for delivering food or messages, teaching everyone in the household to navigate the delicate balance between survival and covert action. Even small lessons, such as identifying which knocks on the door indicated safety versus danger, became critical skills in the everyday operation of this underground system. By nightfall, the visible town remained subdued, lanterns casting soft light on shuttered windows, streets quiet and almost empty. Yet beneath this calm, the underground network thrived. Small parcels exchanged, messages delivered, and acts of covert defiance carried out with precision. The townspeople had discovered that even in the harshest conditions, human ingenuity, cooperation, and courage could create pockets of freedom and support, reinforcing the idea that survival under occupation was not simply about enduring but also about maintaining connection, dignity, and hope. In these hidden corners, life continued quietly and deliberately, with each secret exchange, each coded signal, and each carefully measured action reinforcing the bonds that allowed the community to persist, adapt, and, when possible, resist, even as the shadow of occupation stretched over every street, home, and family. The underground network became more than a practical tool. It became a lifeline, a symbol of resilience, and a quiet assertion that even in constrained circumstances, humanity could endure. As the occupation persisted, fear became an almost tangible presence in the town, lingering in doorways, drifting through alleyways, and settling heavily in the minds of residents. A silent companion that dictated behavior, muted conversation, and reshaped social interactions. Every glance between neighbors carried the potential for misinterpretation. Every casual remark might be overheard, and even the smallest gestures. A door left ajar, a misplaced lantern, or a hurried step could spark suspicion, rumors, or worse. People learned to navigate this landscape carefully, reading not only the actions of soldiers but also the subtle signals of friends, family, and acquaintances, because in a climate of uncertainty, vigilance extended beyond public spaces into the intimacy of personal relationships. Whispers of informants circulated constantly, some based on observation, some entirely imagined, yet all serving to heighten tension. Families were cautious about who they trusted, recognizing that survival often depended on discretion as much as courage. Children were trained to remain silent about hidden activities, to deliver messages only when necessary, and to memorize paths and routines so that they could avoid exposure. Adults developed a similar acute awareness, noting which neighbors seemed overly curious about ration cards, labor assignments, or family whereabouts, and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Trust became a precious, carefully allocated resource, and even close friends sometimes maintained a necessary distance to ensure safety. The curfew, once merely a schedule, now carried an emotional weight, transforming nighttime into a period of both physical and psychological confinement. The sound of boots echoing on empty streets could send a family into silence, waiting in tense anticipation for the patrol to pass. Children lay awake in bed, listening to faint noises, interpreting every shuffle or cough as a possible threat. Adults rehearsed explanations and excuses in their minds, anticipating questions or accusations they might never be asked, while still performing the simple acts of living. Cooking, cleaning, whispering stories to children, and checking on neighbors in subtle ways that minimized risk. Fear extended beyond direct encounters with soldiers. Rumors of reprisal, labor camps, or families removed from the town circulated like wind, shaping behavior, creating tension, and reinforcing caution. Parents spoke in hushed tones about distant villages where entire households had been punished, and these stories, whether accurate or exaggerated, reinforced the lessons of vigilance. The very architecture of homes, hidden nooks, reinforced doors, secret passageways, became integral to daily survival, a reflection of how fear had reshaped not only the mind but the physical environment. Yet fear, while pervasive, also fostered solidarity in unexpected ways. Small acts of compassion, sharing food, checking in on neighbors, or delivering a warning discreetly, carried amplified significance. People learned to signal reassurance through gestures, quiet words, or even glances, creating a network of support that countered the isolating effects of paranoia. Within families, Adults protected children from both direct and indirect threats, teaching them practical skills alongside the subtleties of observation, timing, and discretion, so that even in an atmosphere thick with tension, life and knowledge could continue. The shadow of fear also influenced the rhythms of daily labor and commerce. Markets operated with careful timing. Shoppers lingered only as long as necessary, and vendors minimized conversation to avoid drawing attention. Paths to work sites, wells, and gardens were chosen with scrutiny, avoiding patrol routes or the gaze of soldiers who might pause to investigate minor irregularities. Life became a series of calculated movements, decisions informed by caution and memory, with an unspoken understanding that a single lapse could have consequences far beyond immediate awareness. Even social interactions, which had once been casual and spontaneous, now required deliberation. A shared smile could be risky, a casual greeting misinterpreted, and gatherings were minimized or held only in hidden locations. Yet these small social bonds persisted because they were essential for mental and emotional survival. Laughter, storytelling, and mutual assistance, even in hushed tones, became subtle acts of resistance against the pervasive atmosphere of fear. They reminded residents that despite the omnipresent threat of punishment, the human spirit remained capable of connection, courage, and hope. By the time evening descended into night, the town felt simultaneously constrained and alive. Fear lingered in every corner, yet within that tension, life continued in deliberate, quiet ways. Families prepared meals, children whispered stories, and neighbors passed information or supplies under the cover of darkness. In this interplay of caution and care, the townspeople learned that survival was as much a psychological challenge as a physical one, requiring patience, awareness, and the quiet cultivation of trust, courage, and resilience under the long shadow of occupation. As the occupation persisted, one of the most pressing challenges faced by every household was the scarcity of food, a relentless concern that shaped daily routines, social interactions, and even children's play. Ration cards dictated portions, markets offered only limited supplies, and any misstep in acquiring or distributing food could carry consequences far beyond mere hunger. Families became adept at stretching minimal ingredients, devising creative methods to ensure that meals, however modest, could sustain both body and spirit, and in doing so, developed a resourcefulness that would become essential to survival. Vegetable gardens, once casual efforts to supplement household meals, became vital lifelines. Residents learned to cultivate hidden plots behind homes, on rooftops, and in unused alleyways, planting vegetables and herbs that could be harvested in small amounts without attracting attention. Children were taught to recognize edible wild plants and fruits, sometimes venturing into nearby fields or forested areas under the guise of play to gather what could be salvaged. Even seemingly insignificant items, like discarded root vegetables or the leaves of common weeds, were repurposed into soups, stews, and small side dishes, their preparation guided by both necessity and generations of inherited culinary knowledge. Markets, though monitored and restricted, became hubs of subtle ingenuity. Vendors devised clever methods to hide extra goods, conceal small portions of rice, dried fish, or sugar beneath standard bundles, and exchange them for other necessities in quiet, unobserved transactions. These exchanges relied heavily on trust and knowledge of timing, patrol routes, and interpersonal codes, ensuring that food could circulate without attracting attention. Families, in turn, learned to bargain skillfully, trading labor, small items, or favors for extra nourishment, understanding that survival often depended on both strategy and community cooperation. Cooking under scarcity became an art of improvisation. Ingredients were combined in ways designed to maximize flavor, texture, and caloric value, even when portions were minimal. Soups were made with thin broths but enriched with herbs, wild leaves, or small amounts of dried fish. Rice, often rationed to a fraction of its former quantity, was sometimes supplemented with ground grains, legumes, or vegetables, creating dishes that sustained the body while preserving dignity and taste. Women experimented with preservation methods, drying vegetables in hidden spaces, salting fish, or creating fermented foods that could last for weeks, all while remaining mindful of detection by soldiers who might confiscate any perceived excess. Even small treats, once ordinary and freely enjoyed, became rare and precious. Children learned the value of sharing, savoring tiny morsels of candy, dried fruit, or nuts, often hiding them in secret compartments or behind household objects. The act of eating transformed into a carefully managed ritual, a balance between sustenance and secrecy, necessity and pleasure, and through it, families preserved not only life but also a sense of normalcy and comfort amid hardship. Rumors of hidden food caches in surrounding villages or forests circulated widely, prompting small expeditions by families or trusted couriers. These missions were undertaken with caution and ingenuity, relying on knowledge of terrain, timing, and social observation to avoid detection. Some succeeded in bringing back small supplies, while others returned empty-handed, reinforcing lessons about patience, discretion, and resourcefulness. Each endeavor, successful or not, contributed to a growing collective understanding of survival strategies, reinforcing bonds and trust among those involved. In addition to physical nourishment, these efforts carried profound psychological significance. Preparing a meal, sharing a hidden portion, or teaching a child to cultivate a plant or forage safely became acts of care, resistance, and hope. They affirmed that despite the strictures of occupation, the human spirit could create sustenance, comfort, and continuity, preserving traditions, knowledge, and family cohesion. The daily struggle for food thus became a microcosm of survival itself, a blend of ingenuity, courage, collaboration, and resilience, teaching lessons that extended far beyond the kitchen or garden. By nightfall, after a day of careful preparation, foraging, and discreet transactions, families gathered to share modest meals, often in quiet gratitude for what they had secured. Conversations were subdued, children whispered tales of successful foraging trips or hidden treats, and parents reflected on the delicate balance required to maintain life under the constant shadow of scarcity. In these moments, the act of eating was transformed into an affirmation of endurance, creativity, and hope, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life could persist, adapt, and occasionally even find small moments of joy and triumph amid the relentless pressures of occupation. As the occupation extended into its second year, concerns over health became increasingly central to daily life, a shadow that loomed as persistently as hunger or labor. With limited access to doctors, scarce medicine, and hospitals often repurposed for military needs, families had to rely on ingenuity, traditional knowledge, and communal support to manage sickness and injury. Fever, malnutrition, and infections were constant threats, and even minor cuts or ailments carried potential dangers when medical attention was difficult or dangerous to seek. The fear of illness was amplified by the knowledge that some diseases could spread rapidly through crowded homes, labor sites, and makeshift schools, making prevention as critical as treatment. Women, who had already taken on the bulk of domestic responsibilities, became de facto health practitioners, learning to care for children, the elderly, and injured laborers with whatever resources were available. They boiled herbs for fever, applied poultices to wounds, and improvised splints and bandages from strips of cloth or bamboo. Knowledge of which plants had antiseptic or pain-relieving properties became crucial, passed down through whispered instructions from one generation to the next. Children assisted by fetching water, collecting herbs, or helping with minor care, learning early the practicalities of survival in a community where formal medical help was limited. Some residents attempted trips to distant towns for medical supplies, often traveling cautiously at dawn or dusk to avoid patrols. These journeys were perilous, as soldiers frequently monitored roads, and families learned to balance the urgent need for medicine with the very real threat of capture or reprisal. Success required careful planning, memorizing routes, coordinating with trusted contacts, and using disguises or concealed bundles to carry small quantities of essential remedies. Even when supplies were obtained, families rationed them meticulously, understanding that a single dose might be needed for multiple people over several days or weeks. In the absence of professional care, communal knowledge became vital. Neighbors shared remedies, taught one another how to manage fevers or injuries, and exchanged advice about hygiene, diet, and preventive measures. Stories circulated of successful treatments using unconventional ingredients, crushed leaves, bark infusions, or fermented liquids, and while some claims were exaggerated, the collective effort to pool knowledge strengthened community bonds and increased survival rates. These networks of care extended beyond individual households, reinforcing trust and mutual reliance in ways that also supported psychological resilience. Illnesses, however, carried not only physical consequences but social ones. A family with a sick member faced increased vulnerability. Neighbors might hesitate to interact, fearing contagion. Patrols could interpret visible weakness or absence from labor as negligence or noncompliance. And the emotional toll on caregivers was immense, as they juggled exhaustion, fear, and the constant need to make difficult choices about resource allocation. Children observed and internalized these dynamics, learning lessons about empathy, strategy, and responsibility that would remain with them far beyond the occupation itself. Despite these challenges, moments of ingenuity and compassion emerged. Women devised ways to maintain sanitation using limited water, improvised masks or coverings during outbreaks, and created systems for distributing medicine quietly among families. Children learned to deliver small remedies under the guise of errands, and neighbors coordinated to ensure that vulnerable individuals received food, warmth, and care. In this environment, health and medicine became intertwined with community solidarity, a testament to the resilience of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. By nightfall, after a day of tending to the sick, gathering herbs, and managing household health, the town settled into its quiet rhythm once more. Families whispered prayers for recovery, children drifted to sleep under watchful eyes, and elders reflected on the knowledge that survival was as much about vigilance, ingenuity, and cooperation as it was about strength. Even in the absence of hospitals and formal doctors, life endured, supported by the careful attention, courage, and creativity of those determined to protect one another against the persistent threats of illness and injury. In a town shadowed by occupation, information became a form of currency, as vital to survival as food, water, or shelter, and residents quickly learned that effective communication required both ingenuity and caution. With official channels controlled by soldiers, ordinary citizens had to rely on discreet methods to share news, coordinate actions, and maintain connections with distant relatives or villages. The flow of information was subtle. Messages concealed in hollowed-out books, whispered instructions delivered by children, or coded knocks and gestures communicated what could not be said openly. Every exchange carried weight, as a single misunderstanding or observation could jeopardize both sender and receiver, yet the need for accurate intelligence about patrols, supplies, or community well-being was indispensable. Rumors, whether grounded in fact or fueled by speculation, spread rapidly through this hidden network, shaping perceptions and behaviors. Some stories warned of potential raids or labor requisitions, prompting families to adjust routines, hide supplies, or fortify their homes. Others recounted small victories: a shipment of rice successfully redirected, a neighbor narrowly avoiding detection, or an underground meeting that had proceeded without incident, providing both hope and reassurance. Children, too, became adept at transmitting rumors, often under the guise of play, carrying messages between friends or households while developing an early sense of observation, timing, and subtlety. Letters were exchanged with painstaking care, folded into tiny parcels, wrapped in cloth, or concealed within everyday items such as clothing, utensils, or toys. The act of writing and delivering correspondence required not only discretion but also trust, as interception could have severe consequences. Families learned to encode messages with familiar patterns, inside jokes, or symbols, ensuring that the intended recipient could decipher them while anyone else would see only harmless content. These letters became lifelines, bridging physical and psychological distances, maintaining bonds with loved ones, and transmitting critical knowledge that could not be shared publicly. Public spaces, though monitored, also became stages for communication. Subtle gestures, a bowed head, a flicker of a lantern, a brief pause at a corner, conveyed warnings or confirmations. Courtyards and hidden lanes served as meeting points for brief exchanges, often conducted under the cover of dusk or darkness. Adults taught children to recognize these signs, understand their meanings, and respond appropriately, reinforcing the idea that effective communication required both attentiveness and imagination. The consequences of miscommunication were stark, and vigilance became a shared responsibility. Residents observed each other not with distrust alone, but with careful attention, interpreting signals, context, and behavior to distinguish fact from rumor. Decisions about which information to act upon, which to ignore, and which to pass along were critical, influencing everything from daily routines to survival strategies. Through these careful practices, the town developed a nuanced social intelligence, where every glance, gesture, or whisper could carry meaning far beyond its immediate appearance. Amid the pervasive caution, some stories offered relief and subtle humor. Anecdotes about soldiers' unusual habits, neighbors' clever evasions, or playful misinterpretations circulated quietly, providing small moments of levity that countered the constant tension. Even in fear, people found ways to laugh, share, and connect, recognizing that morale, like food or medicine, was essential for endurance. By nightfall, when lanterns flickered and the streets were empty, the town pulsed with a hidden rhythm of communication. Messages had been delivered, warnings passed, and subtle signs exchanged, all without drawing the attention of soldiers. In this delicate dance, residents demonstrated resilience, ingenuity, and collective intelligence, maintaining both practical and psychological survival. Through whispered rumors, coded letters, and discreet encounters, the community sustained itself, proving that even under the tightest control, information, connection, and shared awareness could thrive, quietly asserting life and autonomy amidst pervasive oversight. Even under the constant pressures of occupation, townspeople sought ways to maintain a sense of normalcy and to escape, if only briefly, from the relentless demands of surveillance, labor, and scarcity. Entertainment, once taken for granted, had to be adapted to the constraints of curfews, ration supplies, and wary eyes, and yet the human instinct for play, storytelling, and music proved remarkably resilient. In homes, hidden courtyards, and quiet alleyways, residents created opportunities for amusement that nurtured the mind and spirit as much as they preserved cultural memory and morale. Children, particularly inventive and fearless, often led these efforts. Games once played openly in streets were now adapted to confined spaces, using improvised materials, coded rules, and silent gestures. Simple toys, scraps of cloth, or stones became the basis for elaborate competitions or imaginative adventures, allowing them to simulate the freedom of preoccupation life. Even chores were sometimes transformed into playful contests, turning water carrying, herb gathering, or food preparation into lessons in skill, observation, and timing, all while remaining under the watchful eye of adults who balanced caution with encouragement. Music, a subtle yet powerful source of solace, persisted in private spaces. Residents hummed familiar tunes, struck makeshift instruments, or sang quietly behind closed doors, sharing melodies that reminded them of festivals, past seasons, and family gatherings. Occasionally, a hidden musician would perform for a small, trusted audience, their music creating a shared sense of beauty and resilience that contrasted starkly with the rigid order imposed outside. These moments, fleeting and cautious, allowed townspeople to reclaim fragments of joy and culture, reinforcing both individual identity and communal bonds. Storytelling, too, became a form of escape. Elders recounted legends, folk tales, and personal anecdotes in hushed tones, weaving narratives that transported listeners to distant times or imaginary worlds. Children absorbed these stories eagerly, practicing their own retellings and learning to convey suspense, humor, and emotion within the constraints of whispering voices and attentive caution. Tales of clever heroes, hidden treasures, or miraculous survival became a quiet mirror of the townspeople's own ingenuity, offering inspiration and a sense of continuity even amid adversity. Small artistic endeavors flourished in similarly hidden ways. Sketches, carvings, and handcrafted decorations were produced in secret, sometimes marking events, seasons, or personal achievements. These creations were rarely displayed publicly, but within households and among trusted neighbors, they served as tangible reminders that creativity and imagination could persist even under strict limitations. Children, encouraged to participate, learned to observe, reproduce, and innovate, cultivating skills and perspectives that were as much about endurance as artistic expression. Food itself sometimes became part of entertainment. Families experimented with rare ingredients, creating small treats, baking miniature cakes, or inventing playful dishes that could be shared discreetly. The act of cooking, tasting, and sharing became a celebration, reinforcing bonds, transmitting knowledge, and offering brief reprieves from the daily grind of scarcity and regulation. Even a single stolen bite of sweetness could brighten a tense household, infusing the day with a sense of pleasure that contrasted sharply with the hardships outside. The overarching theme of these hidden forms of amusement was adaptability. Residents learned that joy could be found in secrecy, play could thrive in constrained spaces, and creativity could flourish even under strict oversight. These practices were not merely diversions. They were vital mechanisms for psychological resilience, allowing children and adults alike to maintain hope, reinforce communal bonds, and reclaim a measure of autonomy in a life dictated by occupation. By evening, when the streets emptied and the lanterns cast warm glows on shuttered windows, Families often gathered in quiet intimacy. Children whispered stories, adults hummed old songs, and hidden games or artistic activities persisted under watchful care. In these moments, the town, though subdued and constrained, remained alive with imagination, laughter, and the persistent determination to find small escapes from fear, hunger, and surveillance. A subtle assertion that even under occupation, life could still contain pleasure, creativity, and fleeting freedom. Under the watchful eyes of soldiers and amid the pressures of rationing, curfews, and restricted movement, education became both a challenge and a quiet form of resistance. Schools, where they existed, were strictly controlled, often repurposed for military needs, and teachers were under constant scrutiny. In response, families, elders, and small community groups developed clandestine ways to continue learning, ensuring that children's minds remained active and that essential knowledge, both academic and practical, was preserved despite the constraints of occupation. Lessons in literacy, mathematics, and history were often conducted at home or in hidden spaces, such as quiet rooms, courtyards, or abandoned buildings. Parents, elders, or older children took on teaching roles, using scraps of paper, reused notebooks, or even etched markings in soil to illustrate concepts. The material was sometimes adapted to the circumstances. Arithmetic exercises might involve calculating rations or tracking foraged food, while history lessons emphasized local heroes, traditions, and stories of resilience. This adaptation not only maintained learning but also connected it directly to the children's lived experiences, making the education immediately practical and meaningful. Practical skills essential for survival were interwoven with academic learning. Children were taught to identify edible plants, understand basic first aid, navigate hidden routes in the village, and observe the patterns of patrols without drawing attention. Gardening, foraging, cooking, and basic carpentry were not merely chores but integral parts of the curriculum, instilling both competence and confidence in managing the realities of daily life under occupation. Even simple tasks like preserving food or preparing hidden supplies became exercises in problem-solving, observation, and planning. Secret libraries and collections of books, handwritten notes, and passed-down stories became invaluable. Elders shared folklore, practical advice, and tales of past events that offered guidance and inspiration. Children were encouraged to memorize poems, songs, and factual information, ensuring that knowledge could survive even if physical materials were confiscated. Storytelling itself became an educational tool, teaching history, ethics, strategy, and cultural identity, all delivered in ways that were safe, engaging, and memorable. Social learning also played a significant role. Children learned negotiation, observation, and subtle communication through daily interactions, understanding coded signals, interpreting expressions, and discerning risk in social exchanges. Lessons in patience, discretion, and critical thinking were imparted not through formal lectures but through practice, observation, and participation in the town's hidden networks of trade, communication, and mutual support. This informal education equipped them not only to survive but to contribute meaningfully to the resilience of the community. The impact of these adaptations extended beyond practical knowledge. By embedding learning within the rhythms of daily life and survival, families ensured that children maintained a sense of purpose, curiosity, and agency. Even in circumstances that could easily lead to despair, education became a source of empowerment, fostering confidence, creativity, and a vision of life beyond the occupation. In many ways, these secret lessons nurtured hope, providing a mental refuge where children could grow, imagine, and prepare for the challenges of both the present and the uncertain future. By evening, as lanterns glowed softly in shuttered rooms and the streets fell silent, children would gather to study, recite, or practice skills in whispers, guided by parents or elders who balanced caution with encouragement. Education, though conducted in secrecy and under constant pressure, became a lifeline, a deliberate cultivation of knowledge, skill, and resilience, quietly affirming that even under occupation, learning could thrive, minds could flourish, and the next generation could retain both wisdom and hope in the face of pervasive control. Even under the constant scrutiny of soldiers and the pressures of daily survival, faith remained a quietly enduring force within the town, providing both solace and structure amid chaos. Public worship was restricted or closely monitored, compelling residents to adapt their religious practices to hidden spaces, small groups, and private rituals that could be carried out without drawing attention. Candles flickered behind closed shutters, prayers were whispered in hushed voices, and altars were improvised with modest offerings, allowing families to maintain spiritual continuity despite the constraints imposed by occupation. Elders and religious leaders, when present, became guardians of both knowledge and ritual, instructing younger generations in ways that balanced devotion with discretion. Children learned to recite prayers, perform gestures, and understand the symbolism of sacred objects, often while simultaneously practicing silence and observation to avoid detection. These teachings reinforced moral and cultural values while fostering patience, discipline, and a sense of connection to something larger than the immediate challenges of hunger, labor, and fear. Rituals were often adapted to circumstances, taking on a dual function of spiritual expression and subtle social cohesion. For example, small ceremonies marking seasonal changes, harvests, or commemorations were conducted quietly in courtyards or hidden gardens, sometimes disguised as domestic chores or children's games. In these moments, the community could come together to honor tradition, share blessings, and reinforce social bonds without attracting the attention of occupying forces. These gatherings, though small, carried profound emotional weight, serving as reminders of resilience, continuity, and identity. Prayer and meditation also became essential coping mechanisms. Families used these moments not only to seek divine protection, but also to cultivate calm, patience, and mental clarity necessary for navigating daily dangers. The rhythm of ritual, lighting a candle, reciting a verse, or observing a silent reflection, provided structure in a life often dictated by unpredictability and threat. Children, taught to observe and participate, absorbed these practices as both spiritual guidance and practical lessons in mindfulness, focus, and endurance. Faith also intersected with communal support and mutual aid. Religious teachings encouraged care for neighbors, sharing scarce resources, and acts of kindness that reinforced the underground networks already operating within the town. By framing these actions within moral and spiritual contexts, residents found motivation and justification for taking risks, whether delivering hidden food, tending to the sick, or maintaining secret communication channels. Religion thus reinforced both psychological resilience and social cohesion, bridging the spiritual and practical aspects of survival. Even mundane routines were infused with ritual significance. The preparation of food, the gathering of water, or the tending of gardens became moments for reflection, prayer, or silent gratitude. In small households, children were taught that each act, no matter how ordinary, could carry intention and purpose, transforming survival tasks into exercises of faith and mindfulness. These practices not only strengthened spiritual identity, but also offered subtle reassurance that life retained meaning, even in a world constrained by occupation and fear. By nightfall, when lanterns dimmed and the town grew silent, families gathered quietly around makeshift altars, whispered prayers, or shared reflections on the day's events. The interplay of ritual, devotion, and community became a source of comfort, resilience, and hope, reminding everyone that despite scarcity, fear, and surveillance, spiritual life endured. Religion, in its quiet persistence, provided not only guidance and solace, but also a subtle assertion that even under oppression, the human spirit could remain connected to tradition, morality, and shared belief. Daily life under occupation revolved increasingly around work and labor, both as a means of survival and as a requirement imposed by soldiers. Men, women, and even older children were drawn into tasks ranging from agricultural production and repair of roads to manual labor for military projects. These duties were often grueling, performed under strict supervision, and carried the constant awareness that mistakes or delays could lead to punishment. Yet within this framework, townspeople developed strategies to preserve dignity, maintain cooperation, and support one another through shared hardship. Labor was structured around a rigid hierarchy dictated by the occupying forces, with clear roles and expectations. Farmers tended fields not only for their families but also for requisition supplies. Carpenters and blacksmiths repaired tools, buildings, or infrastructure for both civilian and military use, and young adults were sent to assist in warehouses, transport, or construction. Each task, while mundane on the surface, was layered with tension, as workers had to balance efficiency with discretion, always aware of the eyes watching their every move. Despite these pressures, subtle forms of collaboration and solidarity emerged. Neighbors helped one another carry heavy loads, shared knowledge of more efficient techniques, and quietly exchanged advice on avoiding injury or punishment. Older workers taught younger ones not only practical skills but also strategies for navigating the expectations of supervisors, maintaining composure, and interpreting orders accurately. Humor, whispered stories, and small gestures of encouragement became essential tools for preserving morale, allowing individuals to endure the monotony and physical strain of daily labor. Children, while sometimes exempt from the most physically demanding tasks, participated in light work or assisted adults in completing more complex projects. They learned the value of persistence, observation, and careful coordination, acquiring both practical skills and the discipline required to navigate a world in which failure could carry serious consequences. Even seemingly minor contributions, such as fetching water, carrying small bundles, or organizing tools, became essential components of the community's overall ability to function. Work sites themselves were scenes of both adaptation and subtle resistance. Residents found ways to minimize waste, preserve supplies, or subtly modify outputs to retain resources for their families. Tools and materials were occasionally shared among trusted neighbors, while small errors or delays were sometimes used deliberately to create breathing space, delay detection, or protect vulnerable individuals. These acts required judgment, discretion, and trust, demonstrating that labor under occupation was as much a test of social intelligence as of physical capability. Occupational routines also influenced social interactions and community dynamics. Workers developed informal signals to indicate breaks, hazards, or the presence of soldiers, fostering unspoken coordination that extended beyond formal supervision. Conversations were often muted, gestures carefully measured, and observation honed to detect subtle changes in schedules, patrol patterns, or instructions. In this way, labor became not only a means of survival but also a medium for communal learning, cooperation, and resilience. By evening, after long hours of toil in fields, workshops, or construction sites, residents returned to their homes exhausted yet resilient, carrying both physical fatigue and the satisfaction of contributing to survival and continuity. Conversations at supper or during evening chores often reflected on the day's work, sharing practical tips, recounting humorous or tense moments, and reinforcing bonds that had been strengthened through shared effort. In the balance between oppression and ingenuity, work under occupation became a lens through which townspeople navigated authority, preserved community cohesion, and asserted their own resourcefulness and dignity, even in the most constrained circumstances. Life under occupation exerted immense pressure on family structures and interpersonal relationships, revealing both the fragility and resilience of human bonds. Homes became sanctuaries not only from the external threats of soldiers and scarcity, but also from the emotional toll of daily hardship. Within these walls, families navigated the challenges of rationing, labor, illness, and fear, relying on routines, shared responsibilities, and mutual support to maintain cohesion and ensure survival. Marriages and partnerships were often tested by the strain of occupation. Tensions arose from disagreements over the distribution of food, prioritization of labor, or protection of children. Yet, in many households, these challenges were tempered by cooperation, compromise, and a shared understanding that unity was essential. Husbands and wives learned to communicate subtly, coordinating tasks and decisions with minimal words, developing a form of quiet teamwork that was both practical and protective. Emotional support became as critical as physical sustenance, with gestures of reassurance, small acts of care, or simply listening serving as lifelines amid stress. Children's roles within families expanded as they contributed to chores, learned survival skills, and acted as couriers or messengers when needed. Parents balanced instruction with protection, teaching vigilance, discretion, and practical skills while also fostering creativity, curiosity, and resilience. The home environment became a careful blend of discipline and nurturing, ensuring that children could grow, learn, and maintain hope even in an atmosphere marked by uncertainty and fear. Extended family networks and neighbors often functioned as quasi-familial units, offering support when individual households faced difficulty. Shared labor, exchanged food, or collective care of sick relatives strengthened community cohesion and reinforced the understanding that survival depended on both family loyalty and broader social networks. These connections provided emotional stability, guidance, and practical assistance, forming a protective web that helped mitigate the pervasive anxieties of occupation. Conflict, when it occurred, was often subtle yet significant. Disputes over scarce resources, disagreements about strategies for evading patrols, or jealousy over perceived favors could strain relationships. However, the shared pressures of occupation frequently encouraged reconciliation and compromise, as maintaining harmony became essential for survival. Families and neighbors learned to negotiate tensions quietly, employ discretion, and prioritize collective well-being over individual grievances. Rituals, celebrations, and shared meals, even in diminished or secret forms, remained important anchors of social life. Birthdays, seasonal holidays, or personal milestones were marked discreetly, providing structure, joy, and continuity amid uncertainty. These moments, though modest, reinforced identity, belonging, and cultural memory, reminding participants that life persisted, traditions endured, and human connection remained a source of resilience and comfort. By nightfall, when the town fell silent and the streets emptied under curfew, households gathered together to share food, stories, and quiet reflection. The intimacy of family life, strengthened by shared challenges, subtle cooperation, and the small joys of everyday survival, created a buffer against fear and scarcity. Within these private spheres, residents found emotional sustenance, reinforced social bonds, and nurtured hope, demonstrating that even under the most constraining circumstances, relationships and family life could adapt, endure, and sustain the human spirit. As the occupation stretched into months and then years, the daily routines, strategies, and coping mechanisms of the town's residents evolved into a complex system of adaptation and resilience. Survival was no longer merely about immediate needs such as food, shelter, or safety. It became an ongoing process of anticipating challenges, learning from experience, and cultivating both physical and psychological flexibility. Families, children, and individuals adjusted their behaviors, schedules, and expectations to create stability amid uncertainty, turning adaptability into a central element of daily life. One striking feature of this adaptation was the integration of routines into every aspect of survival. Households developed precise schedules for rationing food, tending gardens, foraging, and performing labor, minimizing waste and risk. Children learned to anticipate shifts in patrols, adjust play or study times, and coordinate clandestine activities with minimal disruption. Every task was approached with foresight. Decisions about when to fetch water, visit the market, or prepare meals were informed by both experience and observation, blending caution with efficiency. Psychological resilience, though less visible than physical endurance, was equally vital. Residents developed mental strategies to manage fear, frustration, and grief, using humor, storytelling, song, and ritual to maintain morale. The repetition of small, controlled routines offered a sense of predictability and agency, countering the unpredictability imposed by soldiers or resource scarcity. Even fleeting moments of pleasure, such as a quiet game, a shared story, or the taste of a carefully preserved treat, were leveraged to reinforce emotional strength and sustain hope. Observation and learning from the environment became crucial survival skills. Residents noted patterns in weather, patrol schedules, supply deliveries, and social dynamics, adjusting strategies accordingly. Improvisation became second nature. A missing tool was replaced with a makeshift alternative, a scarce ingredient substituted with a wild plant. An unexpected challenge met with inventive problem-solving. These adaptations, developed through trial and error, allowed the town to endure both predictable and sudden disruptions. Community support remained central to resilience. Networks of neighbors, relatives, and friends were leveraged to distribute risk, share resources, and provide emotional reinforcement. Collaboration took on new significance. Coordinated foraging, secret education, collective childcare, and communal alert systems all contributed to the town's overall ability to thrive under pressure. Trust, discretion, and mutual awareness became as valuable as food or medicine, creating a social fabric that reinforced individual and collective endurance. Cultural and emotional continuity also reinforced adaptation. Songs, stories, rituals, and quiet celebrations maintained identity, heritage, and values, reminding residents of life beyond scarcity and fear. These cultural threads offered both comfort and instruction, providing models of ingenuity, courage, and patience that informed the town's strategies for coping with occupation. By preserving traditions in subtle, creative ways, people reinforced the sense that life, while constrained, was meaningful and worthy of effort. By nightfall, when the town rested beneath the soft glow of lanterns and the streets lay silent, the cumulative effect of these adaptations became evident. Households had successfully navigated the day's challenges, preserved essential routines, and strengthened both individual and communal resilience. Survival had become a layered practice of foresight, ingenuity, emotional regulation, and cooperation, a testament to human capacity for adaptation under prolonged adversity. In this quiet endurance, the residents of the town exemplified the subtle power of resilience, the ability to persist, adjust, and even find moments of hope and control, even when life was circumscribed by occupation.